Welcome back to Chess Dog. Today we have a game from the Air Things Masters 2022. Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces. Quang Liem has black. Let's jump right in. Magnus begins with c4, the English opening. Quang Liem responds with knight f6, knight c3, e5, knight f3, knight c6. And here we have the four knights English. Magnus plays g3, defying Keto that bishop and place it on the long diagonal. And you'll see he's preserving maximum flexibility with his central pawns. The D and E pawns are still waiting to be moved. D5, playing it like a Sicilian reversed. Pawn takes, knight takes D5, and bishop to G2. And in this position, white actually has a threat. He's threatening to grab the E5 pawn, and because this pawn on D5, this knight on D5 is vulnerable, that threat actually would work. So the main move here is knight to B6, removing the knight from the center. But here, Quang Liem actually plays bishop to c5, a more aggressive move that also indirectly protects this e5 pawn. So if white takes it, then after knight takes knight, attacking white's queen, knight takes c6, counterattacking black's queen. It looks like a desperado, but what ends up happening is black plays queen to f6. And that combined with the bishop at c5 threatens the f2 pawn, and black has a winning position here. So bishop c5 indirectly defends e5. Castles was played in the game, castles, and queen to c2. And we saw a couple of weeks ago a game between Nakamura and Esipenko where this exact position was reached. Knight f6 was played in that game also. What black is saying, I have more space. I want to avoid the trade of pieces. a3 to keep the knight out of b4, and bishop to b6. In the Esipenko game, he played knight to d4, hitting the queen that way. But in this game, the bishop moved back to b6, and now Magnus plays e3. What he wants to do is to play d4. That looks really hard right now, right? Because black has the queen, the pawn, the knight, and the bishop all controlling the d4 square. But what Magnus is saying is, I've got a lot of ways of getting rid of those controls of the d4 square. I can play b4, b5, kicking away the knight. I can play knight to a4, exchanging off the bishop. I can play rook to d1, and so on and so forth. So Quang Liem plays a5 to stop the first of those threats, b4, b5, b3 to develop the bishop on b2, and now bishop to g4, attacking the knight, which would help support the d4 push, bishop to b2, and queen to d7. And black is setting up this idea of playing bishop to h3 and trading off the very valuable fine kiddoed bishop at g2. Knight to a4, can take the bishop, could even play into c5 if he wants to. Rook f to e8, and d4. Now in this position, if black just takes the pawn, then knight takes bishop, and he has to take back the knight, obviously, because he's threatening the queen. And then knight takes d4, and white just has a much healthier pawn structure. Black has a crippled queenside majority. So instead, Quang Liem takes the knight at f3 with the bishop. Bishop takes, e d4, and now rook f to d1 was played, creating a pin along the d file. Knight to e5, hitting that bishop at f3, and now bishop takes b7, grabbing a little material here. It may seem risky, but it looks like Magnus has calculated it all. Black plays d3, hitting the queen, although there is still this pin along the d file. Here, the computers say that the move queen to d2 is actually the best move, and when black plays c6, blocking this bishop's access to f3 because black wants to play knight f3 check, forking the king and the queen, then just bishop takes knight. And here, white is winning because after you exchange these minor pieces, white recovers the d3 pawn and has a winning endgame. But after d3, Magnus just goes ahead and takes on e5, dc2, and now rook takes queen, knight takes rook. And we see threats all over the board. The knight threatens the bishop threatens the rook, etc. Now, Magnus should not take the bishop here. He has no time for that. If he takes there, then after knight takes bishop, bishop takes rook, the knight would jump into d3 and control the queening square, giving black a clear advantage. So instead, Magnus, first he takes the rook at a8, and now here, if black were to take the bishop and threaten this same knight to d3 idea, white would be in time to come back with the bishop, move it to e4, and control that squaring, keep it from hopping in there. So Quang Liem goes ahead and takes the bishop at a8, and now the bishop moves back to b2, comfortably on the square, helps control the queening square. Knight to c5, offering the exchange, Knight takes knight, which was not played in the game. After bishop c5, rook to c1, bishop d6, rook to c2, white's up a pawn and looks like to be in good shape. The problem is this move, rook to b8, directly attacking b3, and how does white defend it? The only real way to defend it is to play rook to c3, but then bishop e5 hits the rook, forcing it back, and you just go back and forth in a perpetual. And Magnus wants to win this position, so he avoids that and plays rook to c1, allowing black to go ahead and take the pawn on b3, but he recovers the pawn on c2. Now, if we look at this position, compare the pieces, white's pieces seem to be better placed. The rook is more active, and while both knights are on the side of the board, white's knight is a little bit better placed. And black has 2 pawn weaknesses to white's 1, and that's often all Magnus needs. But Liem is an incredibly strong endgame player, so the position will not play itself. King to f6, excuse me, to block the bishop at b2, then king to f1, rook to b8, creating pressure down the b file, bishop to c3, putting pressure on a5. Now here, black plays king to f7, and it probably was a better idea to play rook to d8. That way you create this control of this d file, and the black king can't cross it, and that would have been helpful. He played king to f7 first, and now rook to b2 hits the knight, and black has to do something about that. After bishop to a7 to allow the rook to protect the knight, king to e2, and now there's no time to move the rook to d8. This means that Magnus' king can cross this line and become more active in the main theater of battle. King to e6, king to d3, king to d5, e4 check. After the centralization of queens, white begins to mobilize his kingside majority. He does so with check, king to c6, king to c4, obviously threatening rook takes knight. And then if the knight goes to c5, he would lose it, because after the exchange of rooks, bishop takes, then knight takes knight. So the knight has to go to c1, and maybe he could go to a1, but he's not going to do that. And now rook takes, and bishop takes a5. So now we have a pure minor piece endgame, bishop and knight versus bishop and knight. But if you look at the position, white has an extra pawn. His king is better placed. He's got an outside passer, and this bishop for the moment is quite passive. He'll have to activate it, which he does immediately with bishop to a7, aiming at the f2 pawn. Instead of defending that immediately, Magnus first plays bishop to d2, attacking the knight. So black has to do something about that. Knight to e2. Now he attacks it again with the king. And here, instead of moving the knight, Liem counterattacks the knight at a4 with king to b5. The knight goes to b2. Now notice this barrier that Magnus has created on a4, b4, c4, d4. Basically, there's just no way that black's king can penetrate into the position. This is a very important strategy in endgames, to create a barrier that a king cannot cross. The knight moves to g1, and now bishop to e3. Magnus offers the exchange of bishops because he knows that the king and pawn endgame is a much easier win for him with all the advantages we've already mentioned, but the bishop's off the board, so fewer complications. c5, he wants to keep the bishops on. Now f4, pushing the pawn majority, knight to f3. He hits the h2 pawn and controls e5. That e5 pawn break is the main way white's going to advance the pawn majority. h3, to keep that pawn from being captured. Bishop to b6, and he wants to place the bishop at c7, where it would stop the pawns from both directions. So Magnus plays king to e2, hitting the knight, and the only square it can go to is d4. Anywhere else it either gets lost or trapped. And now he takes the knight, pawn takes, king to d3. And this is a tremendous position for white. He still has this barrier that the king cannot cross. He has a blockaded pawn that limits the scope of the bishop at b6 and can later probably be captured. And again, he still has the outside passed pawn along with the healthy kingside pawn majority. Bishop c5, aiming at this pawn, so a4 check, king to b4, e5, and f5 to try to clog things up a little bit. What if he just takes the pawn, then after pawn takes, and what about just king to b3, hitting the knight? Well, then Magnus could basically ignore the knight and just play a5, and if king takes knight, a6, and the bishop can't stop both pawns. it can only stop one pawn, and white would get one of those pawns to the queening square. So f5 was played to block things up, e6, g6, and now g4. In this position, let's say, for example, black tries to create an outside pass pawn by pawn takes pawn, h5. Maybe he can cause a little trouble over here on the h file. Well, pawn takes pawn, f5. Here, if h4, just rushing to the queening square, then f6, h3, e7, h2, and then white queens first, then black queens. The problem is white has a forced mate here. Queen to b5 check, king a3, knight c4, king a2, queen to b2 mate would be played. So after f5, black would have to play the bishop back to e7 first to keep those pawns from advancing. But then king takes d4, h4, knight to d3 check, king takes, king to e5, h3, f6, and after h2 threatening the queen, just knight to f2. So the knight stops the pawn, and white wins with the two pawns. So Li Quang does not do that. He plays h6 instead, g5, and then h5 to keep it blocked up. What if he takes now? Pawn takes, and now he has these two passed pawns after bishop e7, h4, king to c5, but then this idea, h5, and then a bishop takes pawn, then just pawn takes g6, and again, black can only stop one of the two pawns and the other will queen. So Li Quang plays h5, h4 locks things up, and in this position, black resigned and Magnus won. So what is the winning process here that both sides clearly could see? Well, in this position, if black just plays bishop to e7 to blockade the passer, then king to d4, and if bishop to f8 to check on g7, then just knight to d3 check, and this is a very simple win for white. If he plays king to a5 to keep the outside pass pawn blockaded, knight to c4 check, king takes pawn, and then knight to e5. And white just munches all of these kingside pawns with a very easy victory. Really a beautiful game from Magnus, and a sort of a archetype example of how he plays at his best. Very instructional. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.